Was there a technically advanced, unified civilization on Earth less than 500 years ago? What role did the world's fairs play in introducing forgotten technology? Why did human knowledge suddenly explode in the 19th century? Did someone secretly destroy remnants of old world structures under the pretense of a temporary exposition? Nothing is as it seems. It's time for us to remember again and lift the veil of deception. Collective memory.
And now the mythless man, eternally hungry, stands among all paths, digging and burrowing for roots, be it that he had to dig for them even in the remotest antiquities. To what does the tremendous historical need of the unsatisfied modern culture, the gathering around of countless other cultures, the consuming desire for recognition point, if not to the loss of the myth, to the loss of the mythical home, the mythical womb? Without myth, however, every culture loses its healthy creative power.
Friedrich Nietzsche, The Birth of Tragedy from the Spirit of Music. The most pressing problem of man today is the loss of meaning. Meaning is rooted in the past. When knowledge of the past fades, so does the meaning of life. Today's man does not know where he comes from, who he is, and where he is going. He has become a pawn in the hands of powers that can direct him at will. Uprooted from his past, there is no foundation. And without a foundation based on reality, there is no way to develop an objective understanding of the world. Only the way back to one's roots gives meaning back to life. Epigenetics, the study of heritable changes in gene expression that are not directly encoded in our DNA, suggests that our life experiences, such as hardships, traumatic experiences, etc., are passed on to subsequent generations. Mythological and religious traditions go even further and speak of a collective memory. Already in the Vedas, the holy scriptures of Hinduism, a kind of universal memory is mentioned. The Sanskrit word akasha stands for heaven, space, or ether, and, according to the Eastern wisdom tradition, refers to the most subtle of the 5 elements from which everything else was created. Thus, according to Indian mythology, all thoughts that have ever been thought and all deeds that have ever been performed are stored in this information field, which is also expressed in the legendary palm leaf libraries of India and Sri Lanka. The conception of a world memory also exists in the Occidental culture. We can find similar references in the Bible, for example, when the book of Isaiah speaks of a memory book.
Every activity is a form of energy, and energy cannot be dissipated. It is retained. We are in a closed system. See, everything you do, everything you say, every action you take, every penny you earn or spend is recorded.
So we can assume that all experiences of our ancestors still exist, in an energy field invisible to us. Until around 100 years ago, the ether was still a standard concept in physics to explain the properties of invisible space. And even if today we are largely disconnected from our past, the experiences have not disappeared, but are only buried. Accordingly, it must be possible for us to reconnect with our past if we lift the veil and allow the memories to surface again. In order to access collective memories, a collective effort is required to a certain degree. An individual alone is not able to break through the amnesia. There are images that are so strongly charged with meaning that people are inexplicably drawn to them. The world's religions draw to some extent on such images, albeit in extremely destructive ways. Myths and fairy tales also contain such images. The more a myth is charged with meaning, the more important was its role in our past. By the radiance of a myth, we can already recognize its importance for mankind, if we allow it and let ourselves be touched by it. For example, the flood has burned itself into our collective memory, but so have the stories of giants, dragons, or malicious witches. The more we humans abandon these mythical images, the more we alienate ourselves from our own past and thus from our own being. This process of self-alienation began with the so-called Age of Enlightenment. Immanuel Velikovsky writes,
Amnesia is one of the defense reactions of man. We know the effects of battle shock on soldiers. In the older Greek authors, the Pythagoreans and the Stoics, you find definite statements indicating that catastrophes which occurred in the history of the human race and in the history of our Earth were not abnormal events. They were actually dominant, repeating themselves again and again. But from the historical records, we see that the knowledge of the catastrophes disappeared slowly into oblivion. Plato described cataclysms in several works. He wrote about worlds destroyed and rebuilt. In his Timaeus, he noted that the Greeks do not remember ancient catastrophes besides the deluge. He adds that the people of his time, as the priests of Sais told Solon, were unable to remember these catastrophic events. In another work, whose authorship is probably wrongly ascribed to Plato, he is presented as believing in a peaceful universe. Plato's pupil Aristotle refused to believe in catastrophes. The scholarly world has accepted Aristotle's view that the planets can never change their motions. He, more than anyone else, is responsible for the continuing belief that we live in a safe world, on a planet to which nothing like collisions can happen. Aristotle argued that those who believe in celestial catastrophes should be brought to trial and, if convicted, punished by death. Because of man's aversion to knowing his past, science has been greatly retarded, pretending unreality to be as truth. The Darwinian revolution was also a regression. Disturbing evidence was ignored. It was as if he worked with closed eyes. Darwin proposed that only the fittest survive. His notebooks from the only field trip he ever undertook contain descriptions of cataclysmic disruptions. He wrote that nothing less than the shaking of the entire frame of the earth could result in the mass annihilation of life forms that he observed. Darwin did not accept the implications of the evidence that he saw with his own eyes. The Darwinian revolution was the rebirth of Aristotle, whose ideas had lost ground, if not at the time of the Renaissance, then in the Age of Enlightenment. Even in the Age of Enlightenment, men espoused ideas of a peaceful earth.
In recent centuries, great efforts have been made to make us humans forget where we come from and who we are. The destruction of the old knowledge of physics and biology was particularly powerful in uprooting us. Einstein and Darwin represent the inversion of the old knowledge into a nihilistic worldview, with man as a meaningless, random something, adrift in an endless and cold universe. These anti-life models about reality were perfected only recently, in the 19th century, and could even fully prevail only in the 20th century. Too great was the resistance even in academic circles of the 20th century. The so-called Big Bang theory is a good example to understand how religious esoteric concepts entered science. The Belgian Jesuit and priest Georges Lemaitre created the Big Bang theory, not on the basis of scientific facts, but on the basis of a religious conviction, a notion of a primordial or cosmic seed from which everything evolved. At that time, the Jesuits were given the task of embedding the myths of the origin of the world in a scientific-sounding framework. A few decades later, in 1951, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences accepted the Big Bang theory. This long wait for the Pope's acceptance was not due to opposition from the Church, but from the general public. After all, the Big Bang theory originated in the hands of the Vatican itself. Ironically, the irrational Big Bang theory is still part of our modern worldview, and still not a single proof has been presented. The nihilistic and mechanistic worldview represented by Rousseau and other so-called masterminds of the Enlightenment could only flourish on the breeding ground of industrialization. After all, industrialization turned man into a mechanical being who was reduced to material aspects. Industrialization must be seen as a turning point, and as the most notable event that is still comprehensible and visible to us today as a result of a reset in the 18th or early 19th century. This reset followed an event that also brought about the so-called mud flood. All over the world, the buildings of the old world were partially submerged in the earth, and the former first floors were thus usually converted into cellars. Little is known about the cause of the mud flood, possibly a world war we don't remember or an electromagnetic plasma event. Velikovsky again on this.
C.G. Jung became rather convinced that the unconscious mind, whether by telepathy or in some other way, is a common possession of the entire human race. But it is not only constituted of the experiences of this generation, we who interact in this world today, it includes the cumulative experiences of all generations past. This is more than just telepathy, but something which is brought down from generation to generation. The fact is that catastrophic events have taken place. Not just in a cave here or in a cave there, but events of indescribable violence, such that no human being who succeeded to survive could be free from the traumatic effects. Traumatic effects, as I say, indescribable. Imagine, suddenly, time is no more time. The day does not move into the night. The ocean does not just beat at the coast of the Atlantic, it moves over the continent. Not even moves over the continent. Continent and sea just change places. Where were plains, mountains are thrust up in a matter of hours. The air is filled with loud hissing noises of meteorites falling down and all volcanoes erupting simultaneously. Not just the volcanoes that existed, but thousands of new volcanoes coming up and blazing, and rivers losing their beds, and earthquakes removing cities from their foundations. The human history that starts with the invention of writing is hardly 5,000 years old. Any one of you who reached already the age of 25 lived a full 0.5% of the recorded history. Before I finish, I will read you a letter from one of my readers. I feel that the ancients in myth, epic, and sacred works have been trying to tell us something about a problem that bothered them a great deal. It appears fairly clear that our ancestors were trying to communicate a deep fear, a terrible anxiety. They were talking about a problem that was so terrible that the most drastic measures to group discipline and/or self-repression were justified. It was a powerful fear. It is sometimes suggested that the Bible can directly be applied to modern life, in that all the ancients were really writing about were the problems of survival while avoiding neurosis, worries, unhappiness, and so on. To me, that approach is very unconvincing. The God those people were writing about was terrifying. In the Old Testament, he is the God of wrath. And in the New Testament, as Albert Schweitzer, among others, has pointed out, he is about to end the world in Jesus' lifetime or shortly thereafter. He was dangerous and violent. Rock, fire, flood, hurricane, and similar weapons he used on those he judged ill of. That's what the ancients wrote, and I see no point in trying to water it down. That's what they meant. They were really scared. Immanuel Velikovsky.